Welcome to The Point of View. This is your favorite current affairs show on television, on City TV. On The Point of View, we usually get guests. We ask them relevant questions on issues that matter to you. But every now and again, we bring you an editorial on something that's important that we need to bring some insights into. Tonight is one of such nights. So it's been a week and a few since Russia invaded Ukraine. We'll try and do a quick overview of what the situation is in that country. How has it affected our citizens there? Why has Russia done this invasion? What are the links between what is happening in Russia and Ukraine now and the Second World War, the Cold War, and also the Marshall Plan? Tonight we delve into all those issues and end by telling you why this is an important conflict which we must all pray ends quickly and what it means for Ghana's economy. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So tonight on The Point of View, we look at the grim situation happening in Ukraine. Russia's Vladimir Putin has ordered his troops to enter parts of eastern Ukraine. And we've also seen shelling and attacks in particularly the eastern and the southeastern and northeastern parts of Ukraine. So what is really going on in Ukraine? How did we get here? What is Russia's end game? And what does all this mean for us as a country? Why should we be concerned? That's my topic for tonight on The Point of View. Before we start telling you what we know and giving you the historical antecedents, we want to quickly take you to Duke Mensah Opoku's report. He's our parliamentary correspondent, and he's been bringing you the latest in relation to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ghana's attempt to help Ghanaians trapped in this conflict. He will also let you know the latest with movement of Ghanaians through some of the borders, hopefully back home to Ghana. Here's Duke's report.
As I speak now, there are two of your colleagues who are stranded across the border because they tried to cross with traveling certificates. And I spoke with the embassy in Bern, Switzerland today, and it came to light that they were emailed the traveling certificates and then they printed it and took it to the border guards. Naturally, they will return. Because it doesn't even look like any official paper. So I've requested that they should send an official note verbal or letter to the Hungarian embassy in Prague, informing them and send a detailed list of those who that they issue their travel certificates to, so that when those people get to the border, they get access to cross. Because right now they are going to be in no man's land. They are neither in Ukraine, they are neither in Hungary, and that is a dangerous place to be. Okay? The situation in which you find yourself, you did not create it. We here are going to do our very best as fellow Ghanaians to assist you and to help you. My counterpart and fellow honorary consul, Peter Hens, he incidentally is out of the country. He's in Dubai. Unfortunately, he's under quarantine, so he can't travel. I spoke with him extensively on Friday and then yesterday also, and we agreed that whatever assistance I can render in his absence, I'm going to do it. So, like, what do you call it? Your colleague, Gabriel, said, they are going to take your particulars, your names, and naturally they will be transmitting these details back to Accra, so that your guardians, your parents, your families at least can start breathing easily. If I tell you the number of people I've spoken to this morning, it's not easy. I have got 3 boys. When they go to school in the morning, I know how I feel until they come back again in the afternoon. So you can imagine people back at home who don't even know the situation here. So we are here to assist. It's not going to. The next couple of days are not going to be very easy because the Hungarians themselves have not told us what exactly they want to do.
Ukraine, the country at the receiving end of Russia's military aggression, is home to hundreds of Ghanaians, particularly medical students. Many have expressed concern about the safety of their loved ones and compatriots caught up in the crossfire. But the country's chief diplomat says an elaborate plan is in motion to rescue as many Ghanaians as possible.
As at midday, today, 27th of February, information gathered was that about over 460 students have left Ukraine en route to Poland, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and Czech Republic. The students will be received by officials of our diplomatic missions, honorary consuls, and officials of the students' union or associations. We are pleased to provide the breakdown of those who have exited Ukraine as follows. 132 have arrived in Bucharest, Romania, and our officer on the ground is preparing tickets for some of them to leave tomorrow to Accra.
Shirley Ayoko-Boche provided clarity on the rationale for a scheduled meeting with parents of students in Ukraine on Tuesday.
Meeting with the parents is at 10 a.m. Sorry, I said 1. It's at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, and it's basically for them to allay their fears, tell them what so far we have done. We have a full list of students, over 945, and if there are any parents who have children who probably are not on our list, that would be a great opportunity for us to add on, and also as and when we're ticking off those who have come and so on and so forth. So we want to have that dialogue with them. And of course, they are all, many of them would probably have the wherewithal to pay their way back. And those who, we will pay for those who cannot afford a ticket back.
She also condemned Russia's actions against Ukraine.
I would like to state at the outset that Ghana will continue to unreservedly condemn this unprovoked attack on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a United Nations member state, and we call on the withdrawal of Russia and the end of the war. We also would like to state that Russia bears responsibility for the security and safety of our citizens, Ghanaian citizens, and we call on her leadership to respect humanitarian law.
As Russian tanks and armored vehicles run roughshod through Ukrainian cities such as Kharkiv, Kiev, Lviv, and others, the situation is being monitored back home in Ghana in the hope that government would be able to rescue as many Ghanaians as possible who've been caught up in that crossfire in that far eastern part of Europe. Reporting for City News from the Ministry of Information, my name is Duke Mentopoku.
So clearly a difficult situation. We heard some people have walked for 7 hours to enter places like Hungary and Poland. But why has Russia invaded Ukraine? Is this a reenactment of the Cold War? Some people are even saying this could be the beginning of World War III. Should we be that concerned? What are the historical antecedents of this conflict? What is Russia's calculation? Why hasn't the US intervened more directly? What about other Western countries? Will the sanctions be enough to deter Russia? How quickly will this end? These are some questions that we'll try and answer today. And of course, what does this mean for our economy? It's a very important question as well. But to set us off, we want to take you back to the 1940s. Because what is happening in Ukraine today has to be traced back to the Second World War. We know that in that particular war, 3 nations, for different reasons initially, and then they joined forces. They were known as the Axis powers. So you have Japan, led by Emperor Hirohito. Then you had Germany, led by Adolf Hitler. And then the Kingdom of Italy at the time, led by Mussolini. These 3 had different objectives. So Germany really wanted to take the whole of Europe, take Russia, and eventually rule the world. Then there was Italy, which had its interests in North Africa. It was very concerned about territory in that part of our continent. Then there was Japan, which was interested in parts of Asia. So these countries were referred to collectively as the Axis powers. Initially, the resistance to their foray in Europe was led by the UK and France. So this is Germany trying to annex Europe, Germany and England and France, UK and France trying to fight back. Then, of course, the Russians, when they saw some of the ambitions of the Japanese and also what was happening to them in their own western parts, had to come into this war. And, of course, the US. So you have the Axis powers versus the Allies. I'll show you the three key figures on the part of the Axis powers. So there you have it. Adolf Hitler for Germany, Benito Mussolini for Italy, and, of course, Hideko Tojo. There was also the emperor at the time, Emperor Hirohito. The key figures who were fighting on one side in this war, interestingly, were the USSR, at the time led by Stalin. Is the man who is sitting under the red flag with the sickle and the hammer and the star. So that's the symbol of communism, as it will later be called. Then Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the US president, sat in the middle, and then Winston Churchill. So US and Russia have not always been at war. That's what we need to know. And I'm sure a lot of you know this, that these allies were the three forces. In fact, commentators believe that had the US not gotten involved in the World War, the Axis powers would have succeeded, because the Germans were actually conquering the whole of Europe. They had taken Poland, Austria, and they were marching towards England. So some people think it was the involvement of the US that tilted the force of the war in favor of the Allies. And there you have Sir Winston Churchill sat on the right, representing the Great Britain. So at some point in world history, the US and the USSR were fighting on the same side, right? But what happens with war is that after the war, countries know their true size. So prior to the Second World War, US was not considered a massive world power, but the war awoke a sleeping giant. So you notice that after the war, two world powers emerged. On the Eastern Bloc, you had USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The leader is Stalin, the man on the left. The man on the right now is Harry Truman, who took over from Franklin Roosevelt, who had died in April of 1949. So Franklin Roosevelt was the wartime leader of the US. These two men met immediately after the war to decide how the world will be shaped. What is important to note is that the man on the right, the US, became the almost de facto leader of what is considered a capitalist world. So they believe in free economies, they believe in democracy, and things like this. On the left is Stalin. They were more communist. Now you have two world powers emerging from the war, originally on the same side, smiling at each other, held a few conferences to determine what the world would look like. So this is great. This is not such a bad thing. So first thing to remember is that US and USSR have not always been enemies. They've been rivals. So you can have rivals. They are in competition for global dominance, but they hadn't really clashed yet until the victory of the Second World War. Now, it would appear as though the US and USSR had different views on how the world should be shaped. So communism essentially believes in collectivism, where they have the workers and the people at the center of what they do. Capitalism believes in the private individual, entrepreneurship. They have all these things they put together. So the market dominates. So whilst capitalist countries like the US believe in the market, communist countries say they believe in planned economies. So there was a rivalry between capitalism and communism. Now, the other problem is, after the World War, Germany was devastated. The whole of Europe was shattered. And in US and USSR meeting to rebuild Europe, they came up with a couple of meetings. Now, because Germany was the vanquished, the country was divided initially into four. So this map will show you that in 1945, after the war, the yellow patch, East Germany, was under USSR control. The green patch was under British control, Great Britain, because those were the four leading powers that emerged after the war. The orange patch was under French control, very close to the French border, as you can see. And then the pink or the purple patch down there was the US's part of Germany. So Germany was divided into initially 4 countries. This is 1945 Germany. So what would then happen is that East Germany would follow communist type of policies. Planned market, planned economy. The market doesn't have that much of a role. West Germany, which then would be the UK, France, and US part, would believe more in the capitalist type of things. So then, let me give you a more mature version of the German map now. You would notice that there are 2 countries. The Federal Republic of Germany on your left, which essentially is where UK, US, and France used to control, and then the German Democratic Republic. So the word democracy, both Eastern and Western Bloc countries claim democracy. So planned economies, sometimes authoritarian leaders can still be called democracies. In fact, when the Chinese talk about democracy, they were explaining it in a very interesting way. So yes, eventually you had East Germany to your right. That's the dark red color. And then West Germany. So East Germany, Berlin, West Germany, Bonn. Okay, so far so good. So this is how post-war Germany looked like. But there was another problem. The US felt that Europe in particular, and Europe in general, and Germany in particular, Western Europe, was devastated by the war. And they needed something to revive the economies of these countries. So President Harry Truman instructed his Secretary of State, who was known as General Marshall, to come up with a 50-year plan to develop Europe. It became known later on as the Marshall Plan. And I think this is one of the key antecedents to what later became known as the Cold War, which a lot of people believe is what is informing the thinking of President Putin. A lot of analysts think that President Putin's foray into Ukraine is informed by Cold War ideas. So what was the Cold War? Well, when the US decided to implement the Marshall Plan, this Marshall Plan was going to develop Germany. Now, a lot of the European countries were not very comfortable with this idea because Germany was very aggressive prior to the war. Germany had what they called hyperinflation after the war. The economy was on its knees. The country was getting destroyed. The Marshall Plan was a 50-year plan championed by the U.S. Secretary of State, approved by Congress in 1947 into 48-49 to rebuild not just Germany, but the whole of Europe. Now, Western Europe didn't feel very safe that this country, which was led by Hitler, which tried to rule the world, was going to be rebuilt. So Western European countries came together. They came into an alliance, initially involving countries like Belgium, France, Denmark, Netherlands, Western Europe essentially. They felt that they were not safe with a Germany that would be rebuilt. But let me show you who Marshall is before we get into that. So this is the Marshall, General Marshall. And he was a 5-star general. The Marshall Plan was initially a 50-year plan, 47 to 2017. So essentially ended a few years ago. Clearly it was successful, right? But what then happened was that because the European countries, the Western European countries felt threatened by what would then become Germany's resurrection. Mind you, the Marshall Plan was not meant for just West Germany. But somehow the Europeans didn't feel safe with it. So the United States joined NATO. So the NATO was formed in 1949, an alliance of Western European countries who felt that they needed to be protected against a resurgent Germany. So this was the birth of NATO. But NATO would not be powerful if the US did not join. So for the US to give comfort to Western Europe, the United States later that year joined NATO. So here you have US championing a plan to rebuild Western Europe. Western European countries, except West Germany, didn't feel comfortable with this. US joins NATO to say, I am part of you, we'll collaborate militarily so that if Germany wants to get back to its old tricks, we would work together to fight it. Not a bad idea, right? So far, so good. But the USSR was not happy because don't forget, these are the two world powers. The eastern part of Germany is under communist control. Western part is under capitalist control. What began as a plan to rebuild Europe soon emerged as possibly a threat to the expansion and the ideas and survival of USSR, at the heart of which is communism. So let me show you the way the world looked in the first few years post-Marshall Plan. The world was getting divided. Now on your right is the Soviet Union, which includes Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Lithuania, Latvia, Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine. These are all countries in the red patch that is on your screen. Then you have the countries that were part of the NATO. These are the countries that were united on capitalist ideas. France, Spain, Portugal, Italy now, West Germany. So there's a line there, right? Now there are a group of countries that after NATO was formed, Russia and USSR believed that, look, we cannot be safe with US joining forces with Western European countries and West Germany. So the countries that Russia helped save from Germany's expansion, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, joined forces with USSR to form what was called the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw is the capital of Poland. So you see Poland right there, in between East Germany and the Soviet Union. So the counterpoint to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact headquartered in Poland. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. These are all countries that also border Ukraine, by the way. These countries forming the Warsaw Pact. So the battle lines have been drawn between East and West, between capitalism and communism. So this is how the world looks. But if you look at this map carefully, you notice Turkey is also at the bottom. It's also in green. So whilst the Soviet Union's colleagues are in pink, NATO countries are in green. Looks interesting. But this then begins what is known as the Cold War, where two major powers, two major alliances, two different ideologies, two different views of the world, lots of suspicion. They know the World War killed many people. They don't want to do physical combat. But it led to what then became known as proxy wars in many parts of the world. So now the Cold War had rippling effects in Latin America, had rippling effects in Africa, rippling effects in Asia, had rippling effects in different parts of the world. I'll show you when we come back some of the key proxy wars that the Cold War led to. Then I'll talk to you about Ukraine as well, because Ukraine became caught up in this very interesting chess game between the West and the East. Ukraine being one of the westernmost parts of Russia, bordered by the countries the USSR had saved. And the Donbas region, which is the region of interest with Russia's intentions, coming key in the conversation. This is the point of view. Be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Point of View. Tonight is a bit of world history and also global current affairs. Ukraine has been invaded by Russia. It's been a week and a few days. We're taking you back to the World War, the Cold War, and we're trying to explain to you the antecedents to this. A lot of people believe that the collapse of the USSR and the Cold War is explaining Vladimir Putin's motives. But I will tell you about some of the nuances in there, what Russia really wants in Ukraine, and what the end game would be, and more importantly, what this means for you. So we ended with the Cold War before we went for the break. So the Cold War has begun. Countries to the east, the Warsaw Pact. Countries to the west, NATO. Ukraine is ensconced in the middle. Now, before we come back to Ukraine, a few proxy wars that you can say happened because of the Cold War. Let's go to Korea. So the Korea Peninsula. Korea was originally controlled by Japan. After World War II, Korea was divided by the US and the Soviet Union. So similar issue. So the northern part of Korea borders China and Russia. The northern part of Korea became under Soviet control and dominance. That means they are communist planned economy. So this is now Kim Jong-un. In fact, this is the North Korea that Trump went to try and have peace talks. First US leader to step in North Korea. So North Korea is bordered by China to the north and Russia to the corner. South Korea, capitalist, US support. Now, the Korean War itself was seen as a direct proxy war between the two countries because the USSR supported the North, South Korea was supported by US. Indeed, the invasion of North Korea by South Korea was led by the US. So, South Korea eventually became capitalist and democratic, North Korea communist and authoritarian, right? So, this is one of the manifestations of the Cold War. So, typically because of the division, the so-called Iron Curtain, between East and West, it manifests itself in division. So North Korea, communist, South Korea, capitalist. As we have seen, South Korea appears more prosperous. North Korea has many issues, but it was a direct consequence of the rivalry between the two big countries there. Then let's go to Vietnam. Now, the Korean War was between 1950 and 1953. Let's go to the Vietnam War. Again, there are two parts of Vietnam. Northern Vietnam is supported by USSR. Southern Vietnam was supported by US. So, the war was essentially for dominance. Viet Cong and other parts of Korea, other parts of Vietnam, supported by the South, supported by USSR, pardon me, fighting the South. This was the major war that the US lost. Again, a proxy war between two ideologies. It took 20 years, over 500,000 casualties on the US side. Now, it was a war that nobody would win, apparently. The US did all it could to win this war. Hundreds of thousands of US soldiers died in this particular war. I want to give you some quick highlights on the Vietnam War. Now, it was fought between 1954 and 1975 in South Vietnam, North Vietnam, to an extent Cambodia and Laos. South Vietnam had 850,000 troops. US had 540,000 troops. South Korea had 50,000 troops included. Right? Now, US casualties, over 58,000 military people dead, over 300,000 wounded. North Vietnam, 50,000 people plus civilians dead, over 400,000 to 1 million wounded. Okay? Now, the US suffered a lot of casualties in this war. Partly explains its hesitance in directly engaging in war. Although they didn't learn that lesson, they go to Afghanistan and they spend 20 years there. Afghanistan being another platform for a proxy war between the two. So you have North and South Korea. You have Vietnam, North and South Vietnam, Hanoi and Saigon, right? Then you have even Afghanistan. In Africa, you have Angola. A lot of wars were seen as proxy wars. Of all the wars, there was a Congo crisis, which was seen as a proxy war between the two sides. But the most important of the proxy wars would be the Angola conflict. So in Angola conflict, you had the MPLA, which was considered Marxist, supported directly by USSR. Then you had the FLNA, originally supported by the US. Then out of the FNLA, Jonas Savimbi breaks away and forms UNITA. Now, Agostinho Neto, if you drive in Cantonment, you see Agostinho Neto Road. Agostinho Neto was the leader of the MPLA, USSR supported. Now, the FLNA, US supported, Holding Roberto was the leader. This is Angola War. Jonas Savimbi breaks away from FLNA, initially considered with support from China, but eventually FNLA will disappear and the US will support Jonas Savimbi. So it was a direct war between MPLA and FLNA, which then later became UNITA. That war also spilled over into Southwest Africa, which is considered Namibia, right? Eventually, the war became Cuba's direct involvement. So the Cubans now were fighting in Angola. They are armored tanks. They are Cuban armored tanks in Angola. Cuba, Russia are great allies. Both believe in communist ideas. Don't forget, Castro becomes president in 1959. He and the Russians are very close. So the MPLA is backed by Cuba and Russia. The UNITA backed by US and South Africa, right? So again, the Cold War finding expression in Africa. There are other wars. I don't have time. I will talk about the Ogaden War. This is between Somalia and Ethiopia. Again, it's seen as a proxy war, partly because of the US's failure to involve itself directly in that combat, led to some casualties. Then we go to a very important turning point in the 60s. In 1962, the Soviet Union wanted to put some missiles in Cuba, because don't forget, Cuba under Castro is communist. The US says, what? Cuba is too close to us. We're not going to allow this. So they do what is called the Cuba blockade. They block the advance of USSR ships with their nuclear arsenals into Cuba. It's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was a major turning point. Now, the idea is that we don't want you to come close to us. Cuba is too close to US to be communist. US will not allow Cuba to join the Warsaw Pact. Although Cuba wanted to join the Warsaw Pact, US will not allow this. So you have the Cuba becoming another proxy battleground between US and USSR. So a lot of times you want to understand Cuba, you need to go back into history. So there you have Cuba in there, bordered by Haiti, Jamaica at the bottom, very close. In fact, Guantanamo Bay, so there were 5 sites that Russia was supposed to put its missiles. One was called Santa Clara. There's another one called Guanaje and San Cristobal. Guantanamo Bay, Key West, and Homestead were where the U.S. Navy bases were. So U.S. set up bases in close to Cuba, as did USSR. It was a massive crisis. All right, so this is what we know about proxy wars and the Cold War. Now let's move forward quickly. Now, what is Russia's main problem? Russia is basically saying that what U.S. prevented us from doing in Cuba, they did in Turkey. Because within the same period, Turkey, in the original map I showed you, Turkey, which is quite close to USSR, has military bases for US. So if Russia wants to help Cuba, why is, and US doesn't want to agree, why is US putting bases in Turkey? Now, the USSR believes that there's quite a number of issues with US's position on its supposed invasion of Ukraine. So, for example, US in the 80s invaded Grenada. US invaded Panama. US did stuff in Iraq. In fact, Yugoslavia, which was one of the countries which was supposed to be non-aligned, was invaded in the mid-90s after it got into civil war. But the key issues that the Russians and the Soviets will raise against US is that Cuba, Panama, Grenada are examples of US invasion in countries. There are other claims of US invasions scattered all over the globe that the Russians could point to and say, stop hypocritically telling me I've invaded another country. You've done the same in more places. Look at all these blue dots. These are countries that US has either intervened or bombed or is accused of intervening in. All right. Now, this is the first issue that Russia has, that the US itself does not seem to be holy. It has more issues. It has more debt on its hands. So why are you telling me what to do in my neighborhood? The second problem is explained by this map. So you don't want Cuba to join the Warsaw Pact. Yet NATO is expanding aggressively towards the east. Deep blue countries on your map joined NATO, joined the Cold War. So that's the whole of Western Europe. Now, the light blue map, these are former Soviet states. Think about it. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. Look at these countries. I mean, the Warsaw Pact countries, all right? Poland being the capital, the country whose capital is Warsaw, joins Hungary, Romania, Slovenia, Montenegro. All these countries are now part of NATO. Amazing. This is after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Berlin Wall collapsed in 1990. All the countries in orange. Number 1, Estonia, used to be a USSR state, is now part of NATO. They joined in 1997. Number 2, Latvia. Number 3, Lithuania. Number 4, Poland. A key pawn in the whole war, joins NATO in 97. Number 5, Czech Republic, used to be called Czechoslovakia. So 5 and 6 used to be one country. 7, Hungary, where Ghanaians escaped to. Also part of the Eastern Bloc that the USSR saved, part of the Warsaw Pact, now a member of NATO. 8, Romania. 9, Slovenia, formerly of the Yugoslavia, which broke up. 10, Croatia, part of Yugoslavia, which was originally non-aligned. So 8, 9, 10, 11, all part of Yugoslavia, all are part of NATO. Now look at where Ukraine is. Ukraine is bordered in the north by Belarus, to the east by Russia, to the west by Poland and Slovakia and Hungary, and to the south by Romania. This is the problem that Russia has. Ukraine has expressed interest in joining NATO. Apart from Belarus on top of Ukraine, which is pro-Russia, all the countries close to USSR, Russia are now members of NATO, including Turkey. And you have bases in all these places. So Putin is saying, what's going on here, guys? We can't do anything in Cuba. All the countries that used to be part of us are in NATO. And Putin is seeing NATO not just to defend Western Europe based on the original plan, but basically it sees the expansion of NATO eastwards as an attempt by the United States of America to assert military control too close to home. So basically that map is telling Putin that your arch rivals have brought their ideas home. Now Ukraine becomes a key part of the pawn. Ukraine is a key country. What do we know about Ukraine? So let me show you Ukraine. It's in between Belarus, Poland, Romania, Moldova, Slovakia, Hungary, and Russia. This is Ukraine, split down the middle by the river Dnieper. Kiev is there in the middle. Traditionally, Western Ukraine has been pro-West. Eastern Ukraine has been pro-Russia. Crimea, annexed in 2014 by Russia. Crimea originally was where, during the World War, Russia landed its troops before it defended a lot of the countries around from the Germans. Symbolically handed over to Ukraine in 1954 after pro-Russian Prime Minister was ousted in 2013-2014. Russia annexed Crimea. Some people think it was retaliation. Some people thought this was Putin playing his hand. He has had enough of Ukraine's pro-Western leanings. So by annexing Crimea, and then Luhansk and Donetsk are very close to Russia. They are in the east. I'll show you that shortly. Basically, Putin is worried about the expansion of NATO eastwards. That's the first problem. Now, who are the key figures involved? Let me show you some of the key people. On top, you have Vladimir Putin. So Russia in 1989, USSR, the breakup led by Gorbachev. Boris Yeltsin takes over. Putin comes in initially in 2000, replaced by Medvedev, and then you have Putin come back. So Medvedev is the prime minister, Putin comes back. So Medvedev, still very important in Russia, as the prime minister, Putin is president. Then there's also Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister. Indeed, when Russia announces action in Ukraine, Putin was flanked by Medvedev and Lavrov. Lavrov is not on your map. At the bottom, you have Ukraine. They have more leaders. They've changed. Key point to note, Viktor Yushchenko, between 2008 and 2010. Then you have Viktor Yanukovych, pro-Russian, ousted in 2014 after a lot of demonstrations, replaced by Poroshenko. Now, the current Ukrainian president took power in May 2019. Volodymyr Zelensky, seen to be pro-West. So, not only is NATO advancing east, not only is Russia feeling uncomfortable, now the pro-Western people seem to be dominating Ukrainian politics. So again, from the calculations of Putin, this is not a good thing. This bodes trouble. Now, this is not defending his incursion into Ukraine. We are trying to give you a sense of his thinking, why he would see Ukraine as a prized asset. Now, what is the current state of play? Let me show you what's happening in Ukraine. Now, as I said, in 2013, 2014, he annexed Crimea, which is at the bottom. Crimea, Russia has always considered to be its own. The other point is that if you look on the right of your map, Luhansk and Donetsk, these two provinces have more people who are from Russia. So about 70% of people in Luhansk and Donetsk are Russians. The truth is that most people in Ukraine speak both Ukrainian and Russian. But the places of interest for Russia, apart from Crimea, are Luhansk and Donetsk, right? But look at Kharkov, which is the second largest city in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine's largest city is obviously Kiev, pronounced Kiev. But then there are also other key parts of Ukraine. So, for example, second city, very close. Look at the red map. Russia is making incursions there. Very, very uncomfortable indeed. But why is Ukraine so important? Ukraine is important for a number of reasons. After the World War, a third of Russia's nuclear arsenals were based in Ukraine. In fact, the world's largest nuclear power plant, in fact, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe is based in Ukraine. There was an agreement between US, UK, and Russia for all the nuclear warheads in Ukraine to be moved back to Russia. That hasn't fully happened. Ukraine has good land. Agricultural land covers 70% of the country. So it produces a lot of the world's wheat, a lot of the world's barley, a lot of the world's grains. Ukraine is a strategically important country. Ukraine has a lot of gas reserves. Indeed, the major pipeline that supplies gas from Russia to the Western Europe passes through Ukraine. The other problem is that Ukraine enjoys a lot of support from the Western world. Ukraine is not yet a member of NATO, but Ukraine is the fourth largest recipient of military funding from the US. This is very interesting indeed. So natural gas transits through Ukraine to the Western world. It produces a lot of the world's grain, receives a lot of military support from the US. So if you are Putin sitting in Moscow, you're looking at this NATOization of all the countries that used to be pro-USSR, and you're seeing Ukraine, your younger brother, making overtures or receiving advances from your arch-rival, the US. You obviously will be worried. So this is some of the thinking of Vladimir Putin. Now, what he has done is an invasion, breaches international law. You cannot defend that. But you can understand some of the historical antecedents that could be informing his calculations. Now, the truth is that the world has suffered in the hands of these two superpowers. The US and USSR have either directly or by proxy war destabilized many countries, as I've shown you. Ukraine appears to be the latest in that conversation. It looks like Vladimir Putin is not prepared to back down on Ukraine, because it looks like a symbolic victory. If Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, that is almost like the last straw. Now, some people think his annexation of Crimea was deliberate to put that possibility on hold, because to become a member of NATO, you do not have to have any part of your country's territory being disputed. So for the fact that Russia annexes Crimea disqualifies Ukraine from joining NATO. So that was his initial move. But this invasion is a whole new ball game. Some are wondering, why is he doing this? Doesn't he know he's breaking international law? Well, some people think his calculation is that the appetite for direct war from Western countries is very low. We just saw what President Biden did in Afghanistan. He says the Afghanistan war is taking too long. Domestically, most Western countries will not get a support for war. We are in a COVID situation. The appetite for war, where people go and die in support of some cause, whether Iraq, Afghanistan, is very low. So the calculation, according to many analysts, is that Putin knows this is the best time to strike. Number two, he wants to send a strong message. There's the Minsk agreement, which initially prevents the US from doing some of the things done around the former Warsaw Pact countries. Some people think President Putin wants to talk, and his invasion is sending the strongest signal yet. You notice a lot of Western leaders went to Russia to try to get President Putin not to invade Ukraine. That doesn't seem to have worked. So it seems to have calculated that Western powers will not directly come and engage Russia in a war. Again, Russia has more people. It has the largest land size in the world. It has the most nuclear warheads in the world, more than even the US, right? It's a very powerful country militarily. It sees this as the best time to make a stake for its strength. How has the West responded? That's an important question. The West has imposed sanctions on USSR or on Russia. They've imposed sanctions on Russia. Now, some people think the most biting of these sanctions are twofold. Blocking assets of key Russian oligarchs associated with the administration, and also blocking Russia off the global SWIFT payment. So if you want to send money to somebody in a different country through a bank, it goes through the SWIFT system. Now, the US and Russia don't trade directly too much. So what is key in this conflict is that European countries supporting the cutting off of Russia from SWIFT becomes very key, because Russia has a lot of business relations with the United Kingdom, with France, with Germany, and many parts of Western Europe. So the view is that if this SWIFT ban continues, in fact, Japan has joined the ban as well, Russia is going to struggle economically. Already, The Russian central bank has raised interest rates more than twofold. They are fearing that there will be a run on the banks in Russia. Some people think the sanctions are already biting. Some people even thought Russia's expectation was for a quicker war. We do not know. But what we do know is that things have gotten very tight. From the videos we showed you earlier, the shelling of parts of Ukraine is real. There's also a propaganda war going on. In fact, there are many reports of information war being sent between the two countries. Some via Facebook, some via other social media platforms. So we have a global situation on our hands. The Western countries have said they will support Ukraine. Some are selling weapons, some are supplying support, protective gear. But there isn't any indication that they will physically go into Ukraine to defend it. So this is the situation we have on our hands. So what is going to happen next? And what do all these things mean for us here in Ghana? I think that's the question we should address when we come back. So when we come back, we'll tell you more about what to expect, the economic fallout for the world and particularly Ghana, and how this very complicated situation could end. This is the point of view, an editorial on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to the point of view. So we've tried to show you why Russia has invaded Ukraine, the thinking of President Putin, the historical antecedents, and the way the world works. But what does this actually mean for us? So a couple of things. The BNFT did a very good story today. Russia-Ukraine crisis, over 663 million cedis in trade hangs in the balance. Now, Ghana trades very much with Russia and Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine prevents Ghana from exporting into Ukraine, right? Apart from the fact that Ghanaians living in Ukraine have had to leave. Lots of our students studying medicine, study in Ukraine. They've had to leave the country. Ministry of Foreign Affairs tells us hundreds of them have moved into Hungary. So that's the first issue, is humanitarian. The second issue is that Ghana exports a lot to the region. So we export cocoa and share derivatives worth over 52 million, and manganese and aluminium ore. We also export that into the region. In fact, our export to Ukraine over the past 5 years about 155 million cedis, and Russia is over 1.6 billion. So we export a lot to Russia and Ukraine. Now, we import a lot from those two countries as well. So, for example, we import over 2.6 billion cedis worth of goods from Russia and over 1.6 billion from Ukraine. Now, the primary imports are ammonium nitrate, which is key in producing fertilizer. We already have problem with planting for food and jobs, where we've been told that some of the fertilizer suppliers have not been paid. We also know that fertilizer prices have increased between 2019 and 2021 by threefold, if not more. Now, if the crisis continues, ammonium nitrate, which is used in the manufacture of fertilizer, is going to become a major problem, because not only would the price go up, it's going to become scarce. Our production of fertilizer will run into problems. So that could affect our agriculture. Again, a lot of countries import wheat from the region. I've already told you, Ukraine produces a lot of wheat. We import material. For example, if you're doing some breweries, you need wheat. The conflict is going to affect that. So that's a major issue as well. The second issue is world price of crude. Already, crude prices have hit over $100 per barrel. Now, technically, Ghana is supposed to be a net exporter of crude. So if crude prices increase from 70 to 100, 110, we benefit. But the catch is that only 18% of the crude produced in Ghana belongs to us. So we produce and own about 27,000 barrels per day. But we need crude to power our power plants. And we import over 200,000 barrels per day. So even though we will get a windfall from the world price of crude going up, the amount of money we spend importing crude is going to go up. So it's not a good thing. So number one, on the humanitarian side, our people had to leave Ukraine and come here. Our export into the zone is going to be affected. BNFT is predicting over 600 million. Our import of fertilizer, raw material, and other things we use for the construction industry going to be affected. So it's very possible that cost of production in agric, cost of construction is going to go up. And then more importantly, world price of crude. Already, we are paying over 8 cedis per litre for petrol. If crude prices keep going up, some predict we are going to pay as much as 10 cedis per litre. We are already suffering from a COVID-19 depression. If this conflict doesn't end pretty shortly, we are going to run into a lot of problems. Now, 3 key things to look out for. What is the UN going to do? UN Secretary General has spoken. UN is not in a very strong position. Antonio Guterres' tweet sounded very weak. The global order is problematic. The Security Council has Russia, China, US, and all these guys. It's a very complicated situation. UN is not in a very powerful position. The West have decided to impose sanctions with a wait-and-see attitude. They don't want to do direct engagement. I think the final pawn to all of this is China. If China supports Russia, this could go on for a longer time. If China says, we don't believe in invading another country, and they don't explicitly support Russia, this could end quicker. But we don't have that indication. China explained that what happens is not even an invasion. So essentially, it looks like Russia has China's support. We may have to be in for the long haul. What can we do? Well, there's going to be a very important Security Council meeting. Ghana is a member of the Security Council. We're going to hear what Ghana is going to say. Not that it counts necessarily globally at that extent, but the UN may still be the path to resolve this big crisis. Till that is done, let's work hard, let's pray hard, and hope that this conflict ends quicker than anticipated. Otherwise, we're all in trouble. Thank you for watching. We hope you've learned something. It's been a quick run through the Ukrainian conflict with Russia with a historical perspective. Hope it's giving you some further insight into the matter. We'll be with you next time on The Point of View. The Business Dashboard is next. Bye-bye.
The Point of View is brought to you by Cowbell Coffee. Cowbell Coffee. Taste it, love it. Kel Charcoal Toothpaste. Kel Charcoal. Happy smile.